Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to set up an elaborate trap for a thief, but desperate times call for desperate measures. This is the story of how I caught my neighbor stealing my gasoline and made them regret ever messing with me. It all started about 6 months ago when I noticed something odd about my truck's fuel gauge. I have a Ford F-150 that I use for work. I'm a contractor, so I needed to haul materials and tools to job sites. Every Sunday evening I'd fill up the tank so I'd be ready for the work week. But for several weeks in a row, I'd get in on Monday morning to find the gauge showing a quarter tank less than when I'd parked it. At first I thought maybe there was something wrong with the gauge, or maybe I had a leak somewhere. I even took it to my mechanic, but he couldn't find anything wrong. That's when I started paying closer attention to my fuel consumption. I kept a detailed log of my mileage and how much gas I was using. The numbers didn't add up. I was losing way more fuel than I should have been. Someone was definitely stealing my gas. My first thought was to install security cameras, but my budget was tight after some recent home repairs. So I started parking my truck in different spots around my property, trying to figure out when and where the theft was happening. That's when I noticed my next-door neighbor always seemed to be watching whenever I moved my truck. He'd be checking his mail or working in his yard every time I came home. Something felt off about it. This neighbor had moved in about a year ago. He was the kind of guy who was always showing off his fancy cars and bragging about his high-paying job, but lately his expensive vehicles had been sitting in his driveway, unused. I'd overheard him arguing on the phone about money a few times, too. One evening, I decided to test my theory. I parked my truck in clear view of his house and pretended to go to bed early. Instead, I sat in my dark living room, watching through the window. Sure enough, around 11 p.m., I saw a figure sneaking across my driveway with a gas can and siphoning hose. I was furious, but knew I needed solid proof before confronting him or calling the police. That's when I came up with my plan. I went to my local auto parts store and bought a locking gas cap, but I didn't install it yet. I also picked up a trail camera that hunters use to track deer. It was cheaper than a security system and would work perfectly for catching someone in the act. I mounted the camera in a tree overlooking my driveway and waited. For the next week, I recorded crystal clear footage of my neighbor stealing gas from my truck almost every night. He'd wait until late, sneak over with his gas can, and help himself to my fuel. I did some quick math. He'd probably stolen several $100s worth of gas over the past few months. But I wasn't done gathering evidence yet. I had something special planned. I went to another auto parts store in the next town over and bought a gas can identical to the one my neighbor used. Then I filled it with a special surprise. A mixture of water and a bright red dye that mechanics use to detect engine leaks. It wouldn't damage an engine permanently, but it would definitely cause it to stall and require an expensive flush to fix. That Saturday, I made sure my neighbor saw me filling up my truck with this special mixture. Then I parked in my usual spot and waited. Like clockwork, he crept over around 11 p.m. with his gas can. I recorded everything on the trail cam as he siphoned out about 2 gallons of my special brew. Then I waited for morning. Sure enough, around 7 a.m. I heard the distinctive sound of an engine trying to turn over but failing. I peeked out my window to see my neighbor in his fancy BMW repeatedly trying to start it. The look of confusion on his face was priceless. I waited until he called a tow truck before making my move. I walked outside, trail camera and all my documentation in hand. "Having car trouble?" I asked innocently. He looked up, startled. Yeah, won't start for some reason." "Might have something to do with the water and dye you siphoned from my truck last night," I said calmly, holding up my phone showing the trail cam footage. His face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Really? Because I have weeks of video showing you stealing my gas. Would you like to see?" I started playing one of the clips. He tried to bluff his way out. "That could be anyone. You can't prove anything." "Actually, I can. I have time-stamped videos, photos of your gas can, and receipts showing how much fuel I've been losing. Plus, when the mechanic checks your car, they're going to find bright red dye in your fuel system. Want to guess where that came from?" He started to look nervous. "Look, man, I can explain." I cut him off. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to pay me back for every gallon of gas you stole. I figure about $400 worth. You're also going to cover my security expenses, the trail cam and locking gas cap. That's another $150, and you're never going to come near my property again. Otherwise, all this evidence goes straight to the police." "That's blackmail," he sputtered. "No, it's giving you a chance to make this right without getting arrested for theft. Your choice." The tow truck arrived just then. I smiled and added, "Oh, and good luck with your car. Might want to tell the mechanic about the water in your gas tank. It'll save them some diagnostic time." He glared at me, but finally broke. Fine, I'll pay you back, just don't call the cops. I want the money by Friday, and I'd start looking for somewhere else to live if I were you. Once the neighbors hear about this, they won't be too friendly. He ended up paying me $550 in cash that Thursday. The repair bill for his BMW came to over $1,200 according to the mechanic's invoice I saw in his trash. Best of all, he put his house up for sale the following week. I installed the locking gas cap on my truck anyway, just to be safe. But the whole neighborhood soon heard about what happened. Funny how gossip spreads. No one's tried to steal my gas since then. Some might say I went too far with the dyed water trick, but I say he got off easy. He could have faced criminal charges and done real damage to my livelihood by leaving me without fuel for work. Instead, he just had to pay for what he stole and learn a valuable lesson about respecting other people's property. The house sold quickly and we got much better neighbors. A young family that actually takes care of their own car and gas. Sometimes the best revenge is simply letting someone face the natural consequences of their actions while making sure they can't take advantage of you anymore. Edit. Wow, this blew up. Thanks for all the supportive comments. To answer some common questions. 1. Yes, I checked with my lawyer first. Since I was putting the mixture in my own gas tank and had warning signs about tampering, I wasn't liable for any damage. 2. The red dye was just standard UV dye that mechanics use to find leaks. Totally legal to buy and use. 3. For those asking about the exact mixture, nice try, but I'm not giving anyone ideas. 4. The neighbor did try to say he would sue me, but once his lawyer saw my evidence, he backed down fast. 5. Yes, I still have the trail cam up, just in case. Better safe than sorry. Update. It's been 6 months since this all went down, and things have gotten even more interesting. Remember how I mentioned the neighbor was having money troubles? Well, it turns out my gas wasn't the only thing he was stealing. The family that bought his house found a bunch of stolen Amazon packages hidden in the attic while they were renovating. They called the police, who linked him to a string of porch piracy cases in our area. They also found evidence that he'd been running some kind of credit card scam. He's now facing multiple charges and looking at serious jail time. His fancy BMW got repossessed too. Guess he wasn't making payments on it either. Karma really does come back around. The new neighbors are great. They actually brought us cookies when they moved in and invited us to their housewarming party. We all had a good laugh about the gas thief and his downfall. Best part? They installed security cameras all over their property, so our whole street is now pretty much theft-proof. Sometimes bad situations lead to positive changes for everyone. Final update. The story keeps getting crazier, folks. The ex-neighbor's court case finally wrapped up, and let me tell you, what came out during the proceedings was wild. Turns out my gas wasn't even the tip of the iceberg. During the investigation, they found out he'd been fired from his fancy finance job 6 months before he started stealing my gas. He'd been running a Ponzi scheme at work, taking money from new clients to pay off older ones. When it all fell apart, he started stealing to maintain his lifestyle and keep up appearances. His wife testified at the sentencing hearing she had no idea about any of it until the police showed up at their door. She'd thought they were just going through a rough patch when he said they needed to cut back on expenses. She divorced him right after he was arrested. The judge really threw the book at him. He got 3 years for the financial crimes, plus another 18 months for all the theft charges. He also has to pay back over $200,000 in restitution to his victims. His fancy BMW repossessed. The house foreclosed. All those designer clothes and watches he used to brag about seized to pay his debts. One of my other neighbors came forward during the investigation and admitted she'd seen him stealing my gas a few times, but was afraid to say anything because he'd threatened to hurt her dog if she told anyone. That added witness intimidation to his charges. The new family that bought his house had to deal with debt collectors showing up for months until they could prove they weren't connected to him. They're great neighbors, though. They actually started a neighborhood watch program after moving in. We all pitch in to keep an eye on each other's properties now. The whole experience really brought our street together. We have monthly block parties now, and everyone looks out for each other. Last week, when my truck broke down, 3 different neighbors offered to give me rides to work until it was fixed. That's the kind of community I always wanted. Looking back, I'm glad I handled it the way I did. Sure, I could have just called the cops right away when I first suspected him, but then we might never have uncovered the full extent of his crimes. My little trap helped expose his true colors and got a real criminal off the streets. For anyone dealing with similar issues, document everything, gather evidence, and don't be afraid to stand up for yourself. Just make sure you do it legally and smartly. Trust your instincts if something feels off, but be smart about how you handle it. The trail cam is still up, by the way. Haven't caught anyone stealing since then, but I did get some great footage of a family of deer that like to hang out in my yard at night. Much better than catching thieves. Oh, and that locking gas cap? Still the best $30 I ever spent. Though these days, with gas prices what they are, might need to add a security system for my whole truck. As for the ex-neighbor, last I heard he's trying to write a book about his journey to redemption from prison. Good luck with that, buddy. Some lessons you learn the hard way, and some people never learn at all. But hey, at least my gas tank stays full these days. The next one is a pro-revenge story. This one is fresh and still unfolding, but it's already hit an explosive level. Some details intentionally vague. Context: I'm a woman in my 30s with a reasonably good corporate-type job in a field with lots of room for growth, and am recently back into the dating scene after a decade. I'm kind of a would-be a 10 if she lost 30 pounds looking girl. Beautiful face if a bit chubby, but I never have issues getting a date. I'm not well off, but I'm stable and have a bit of spending money. I live in a large multicultural city and my ex was an immigrant, so I'm open to dating people of any origin. What happened? A few weeks ago, I met a very charming man from a Latin American country only a couple years younger than me. Seemed very sweet, cuddly, intelligent, family-oriented, emotionally available, educated, and in a good profession back home in his country, and had a lot in common with me. Chemistry seemed amazing inside and outside the bedroom. He was honest that he was in my country on a tourist visa, but hoping to stay. I made it clear I wouldn't be able to help him with that, but we'd have a fun summer fling while he was here. If he managed to stay or come back, only then would we consider a real relationship. Then the other shoe dropped. A couple weeks and 4 dates in, during a text conversation about my work, he asked me to be his sugar mommy. I initially laughed and assumed it was a joke. He kept pushing and clearly said it wasn't. Of course, feeling insulted by this, I went off on him. He maintained it as a serious ask until I hit a nerve with my complaints about how embarrassed he should be to ask me that. Then he got angry and insulted me for thinking he was serious about it. No apology for being hurtful to me. Obviously, what I did next was take screenshots and cry about it to my closest friends. I was hurt that I was fooled into thinking he liked me and that he thought I needed to pay for a man. My friends started the fuse on what happened next. One of my friends started snooping more on his online presence. Together, we found about 6 different Instagram accounts that were him using different variations of his name and different photos of himself all uploaded in batches. On Facebook, a similar pattern, all very scammy and suspicious looking. He'd been foolish enough on one of his profiles, though, to follow and tag the employer that he was working for illegally on his tourist visa in my country. So I contacted another close friend in a local law enforcement agency that works with immigration. She looked up his file. He had a wife and daughter at home. I released the hounds after that. The friend who helped me investigate online made several group chats on multiple platforms with all of his family, immediate and extended, and friends. She released all the screenshots as well as a rant about how shameful it was. As they started blocking her, she added more people. I found his sister's phone number. She sent her messages on there too. Everyone he knows, including his wife, know he's unfaithful and trying to take advantage of women. 30 mins after the online bombardment started, I got a rude message from him about how I should be smart enough to know he was joking and he doesn't need to sell himself. I didn't reply. Next step? Online immigration reporting form with all the info we found, work info, employer name and address, his home address, full name, DOB photos, screenshots admitting to working. Usually these reports take months to be reviewed, if at all, but I gave the file number to my law enforcement friend. 2 days later, law enforcement officers visited him at home. They found him with a phone number that was issued to a local resident. All his roommates also had numbers issued to the same person, a direct link to the employer. He received a caution for trying to scam me, a no-contact order and a flag on his immigration file that, based on his country of origin, will likely mean he can never return, as well as a strict warning to not work without authorization. His roommates also received warnings. His employer received a visit next. They found significant proof that they'd been employing him illegally as well as multiple other people. Their investigation is still ongoing, but so far they are likely to receive tens of thousands in fines or possible jail time. The guy isn't getting deported because the government would have to pay for it, and proceedings take longer than his remaining visa time, but he's now upgraded from a flagged file to a multi-year ban on re-entry to my country. If he bothers me again, though, he will be deported as well. Hope he enjoys going back to his angry wife and the ridicule from everyone he knows. See ya again, never. The next one is a malicious compliances story. Back before cell phones and TSA checkpoints, I was working as an admin assistant. Ray was my department head and had a great sense of humor. When I was hired on, Ray made sure I understood that I worked for him. Even though I would do some office-wide work, he was my boss. Clint was in charge of another department in our office. Flying from our office to a satellite office for a day or two was common for people in both departments, and I was in charge of making standard pre-approved travel arrangements. If someone needed to change unexpectedly, they were supposed to handle those themselves. Clint seemed unable to understand that. At some point, Clint decided that he wanted to cut travel costs. Lowest possible fare, lowest possible rate for his department. Lowest possible fares were always the 5 a.m. outbound and 11 p.m. return flights. Clint didn't care. A couple of weeks into this policy, Clint is to headed to the satellite office for some in-person meetings. Game on, lowest possible fare, lowest possible rate. Clint left on the 5 a.m. flight. The lowest rate car rental company didn't keep their cars available at the airport. Clint had to take the shuttle to their off-site location to pick up his car. Sadly for Clint, the shuttle didn't start running until 8, when his first meeting was scheduled to start. Oops. The client refused to reschedule that day, but agreed to the next morning. At some point, it dawned on Clint that he either had to fly home and back or get a room for the night. He chose to get a room, and of course, call me. One lowest possible rate room coming up. Unsurprisingly, that room didn't have security on site like he was used to. It did have little multi-legged friends if his complaints were true. The next morning, Clint headed out in the previous day's suit, only to discover that his car had been broken into overnight. The police took their time arriving, and by the time they were done, Clint had missed his meeting again. Somehow, Clint got the client to reschedule again, and he decided to take the flight home and back the next day. Of course, I was kind enough to remember the lowest possible fare rule, so Clint was booked on the 11 p.m. flights home and 5 a.m. return, even though his meeting was midday. This time, the lowest rate car was at the airport, so Clint got to skip the shuttle. Sigh, you can't win them all. At that point, Clint's lowest possible policy had already cost the company at least double what a normal trip would have. Not to mention all the time I had spent calling hotels, motels, and car rental companies. The next day, he's on the 5 a.m. flight and makes it to his meeting. I don't know when he realized that he didn't want the lowest possible fare at 11 p.m. I do know he decided to take the more expensive, earlier flight home both days. Somehow he discovered that he could change that himself. The next time I saw Clint, he tried to fire me. Too bad I worked for Ray, who knew and laughed about the whole thing. Clint was furious, but there wasn't anything he could do. The company would back Ray, and Ray was backing me. Clint changed the room rate policy because of his experience, but refused to rescind the lowest fare and lowest rental rate policy. That was until accounting let slip that not only had Clint figured out how to take the higher-priced earlier flight, he figured out an upgraded seat as well. Clint found himself with an entire department intentionally missing their 5 a.m. flights and rebooking for the more expensive 8 a.m., which somehow only had upgraded seats available every time. Rental car reservations were missed and more expensive cars were rented. Meetings that were previously in the office were somehow only available after hours, so clients were taken to dinner. Dinner included alcohol, so rooms were booked at hotels closest to the restaurants and returning flights scheduled for the next day. Less than a month later, all lowest price policies were rescinded. I was allowed to book normally again, and the missed flights, upgraded seats, and fancy hotels disappeared. Dinner meetings remained, but decreased dramatically. When I left, Clint's reputation still hadn't recovered. The next one is an entitled people's story. This has been building up for months, and I honestly do not know what else I could have done. My neighbor, Karen, not her real name, but let's be honest, it fits, has been convinced that I am stealing her packages. For context, we live in a duplex, and our porches are right next to each other. Sometimes delivery drivers mix things up and leave her stuff on my side, but I always bring it over to her porch. I've never kept anything that wasn't mine. Despite this, Karen has been on a rampage. She's been telling everyone in the neighborhood that I am a thief, and she has banged on my door multiple times, yelling at me and demanding I return her things. Every single time it turns out her packages were either misplaced or late, but she never apologizes. A few days ago, she came over again, furious, claiming I had taken another package. I told her I hadn't seen anything, but she would not let it go. She started yelling and accusing me of being a liar, and then she said she was going to teach me a lesson. That set off alarm bells, so I grabbed my phone and started recording audio. I didn't expect what happened next. She went back to her porch, sat down, and started talking loudly to someone on the phone. Except, based on what she said, I don't think anyone was actually on the other end. She was ranting about how she was going to dump trash all over my yard and break my stupid garden gnome to make me confess. At that point, I had enough. I played the recording for the HOA and asked them to handle it. They fined her for harassment and told her that if she set foot on my property again, they'd escalate it further. She hasn't spoken to me since, but now she's telling everyone I'm spying on her and trying to ruin her life. A few neighbors are saying I went too far by recording her and reporting it instead of trying to be neighborly and talk it out. But what was I supposed to do? She was already threatening to vandalize my property and accusing me of theft for months. I feel like I did what I had to do to protect myself. So now I'm stuck with Karen glaring at me every time we cross paths, and half the neighborhood thinks I'm in the wrong. Am I? Or did I just finally stand up for myself? Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.